Hello, everyone, and welcome to this live, fully active webinar brought to you by the Monroe County Bar Center for Education. I'm Catherine McCarley, and I am a civil litigator in Rochester, New York with the law firm Underberg and Kessler. I'm also your moderator tonight, and I'm excited to be here with you all. Thank you for having me. Today is February 10th, 2022, and this is Voter Suppression Then and Now, Protecting Our Democracy, hosted by the Lawyers Coalition for Racial and Social Justice. At this time, I'd like to give a special thank you to the Monica Law Firm and Cam Holtz Rossi PLLC for sponsoring today's program. The Monica Law Firm concentrates on workers' compensation, employment, and disability benefits cases. Cam Holtz Rossi PLLC provides personal injury, medical malpractice, and construction injury representation, using creative and adaptive methods to provide results. For those attending who are interested in continuing legal education credit and to comply, for those interested in continuing legal education credit and to comply with accreditation regulations, please fill out your affirmation form and evaluation sheet at the end of today's program and email that back to Debbie Ryan. In exchange, you will receive your certificate of attendance for today's program via email. Please note that all attorneys must attend today's program in its entirety to receive credit. According to the New York State Continuing Legal Education Board, CLE providers are prohibited from issuing partial credit. Please also note that everyone's line has been muted for the presentation portion of this session. If you have a question for the panelists during the program, please submit it using the Q&A feature. You may also send questions to fellow audience members or to the host if you're experiencing some technical difficulties. And now that we have housekeeping out of the way, I would like to just give a general overview of today's program. So as many of you know, voter suppression is not a new concept. It has historically and disparagingly affected marginalized groups, taking the form of poll taxes, roll purges, and voter ID requirements, and much more. However, in some instances, voter suppression methods are not always as overt as those examples. Regardless of the form, efforts must be and have been made to circumvent the oppressive effects of voter suppression methods. Now, the goal of today is not just to receive CLE credit, but also to inform, engage, and encourage. Inform those who may be unaware or misinformed, engage with each other, and encourage open, productive conversation. Now, I personally am not an expert on today's topic, but I am excited to introduce two panelists who are. Our first panelist is attorney Derek Tisler. Derek serves as the counsel for the Brennan Center for Justice's Democracy Program. His work focuses on issues related to election administration, security, and disinformation. Thanks for being with us today, Derek. Our second panelist, Barb Grosh, serves as the president of the League of Women Voters of the Rochester metropolitan area. Barb has experience as an election inspector working in both high and low turnout districts in Western New York. Before the 2020 general election, she also worked at the Monroe County Bar of Elections, assisting with the processing of absentee ballot requests. Thank you for joining us today, Barb. Now that I've introduced the speakers, I would like to take a moment to let you all know how today's program will run. First, we'll hear from both of our speakers. Then we'll transition into a Q&A session for today's program. Lastly, we'll close with some closing remarks from our speakers. Please feel free to enter your questions using the Q&A feature during the presentation, and we will address them during the Q&A portion of today's program. And with that, I would just ask that Derek kindly open today's discussion and provide the audience with an overview of voter suppression tactics at the federal level and as well as states across the United States. So Derek?
Thank you, Catherine. And thank you for having me to talk before this group here. As Catherine said, my name is Derek Kissler. I'm a counsel with the Brennan Center, which is a law and policy institute based out of New York City. But my work takes me nationally, and certainly that's been my focus during the 2020 election and in everything that has followed. I am going to share my screen here because I have some slides that I wanted to put up here as we're talking through really what vote suppression looks like right now in the wave of bills that we're seeing since the 2020 election. And before getting into that, I think it's good that we take a step back and we think about really understanding what happened in 2020, understanding how different that election was, and how much the choices that were made in that election, the choices both by election officials and policymakers, as well as voters themselves, are shaping how legislators are thinking about elections moving forward. And the biggest reason that the election was different in 2020 was, of course, because of the pandemic. Just as COVID-19 upended every part of our lives, it also upended how we run elections. And I think in March 2020, when the pandemic really started and election officials started thinking through what they need to do, there were three major questions that came up. So one was, how can we make sure that people with COVID or who are afraid of contracting COVID can still safely cast a ballot? Another was, how can we keep voters and election workers safe at polling places? And then third, how can we do all of this while ensuring that our elections are secure and resilient? And it turned out that the key to answering all these questions was giving voters options, multiple ways that they can cast their ballot. So voting by mail, allowing voters to safely receive and cast a ballot without leaving their home if they choose to do so. And then voting early before Election Day, increasing the number of days when voters can cast a ballot in person in order to reduce crowding at polling places. And importantly, these options actually advance a number of key goals at the same time. So they not only made elections more safe and accessible for voters, they made our elections more secure and resilient at the same time. And that's because having multiple ways that voters can cast ballots reduces the stress on our technical systems at any more time and sort of gives more opportunity to respond to technical failures and address any challenges going forward. Another helpful thing that expanding voting options had going for it is that it's actually nothing new in American elections, as many of you are aware. Early and mail voting in particular is central to one of the most important shifts that we've seen in election administration over the past 3 decades. So I never miss a chance to share what is maybe my favorite chart in election administration. It's called the snow globe chart. And this chart shows for each state the share of voters that voted on Election Day, voted early, or voted by mail. And you see that in 1996, with a couple of exceptions, Washington and Oregon mainly, nearly all voters cast their ballot by going to the polls on Election Day, as they had done for hundreds of years before that. But especially in recent years, you see in 2016, this is sort of why it's called the snow globe chart, states really began trickling down from the top of that chart down to the bottom corners there. In 2016, the predominant voting method in 14 states was something other than in-person Election Day voting. And then in 2020, we see that states have spread out to fill that whole space. So in 35 states, something other than Election Day voting was the predominant method. And in a majority of states, mail voting was actually the most common way that voters cast their ballot. And because these alternative voting methods were so well established in so many states before 2020, there were ample best practices to borrow from as each individual state sought to expand their own methods and make these methods more accessible and secure. So some of those best practices included allowing voters to register to vote and request ballots online, setting up secure drop boxes for voters to return their ballots without needing to rely on the post office, offering convenient early voting locations and allowing voters to look up wait times so that they weren't just standing around in crowded places, processing mail ballots early to avoid sort of long counting delays after the election, and then counting mail ballots so long as they're postmarked on or before Election Day so that voters are not disenfranchised by mail delays. And another important thing that these expanded voting options had going is that not only were they well established, before 2020, they were not partisan. The polling data that I have displayed here shows that from 2004 to 2016, Democrats and Republicans had very similar views when it came to whether mail-in early voting was a good thing and whether they intended to use these options to cast their ballot for an upcoming election. But as I'm sure you're all aware, 2020 was really a turning point when it came to partisan views on these expanded voting options. So as political leaders in the Republican Party attacked mail voting in particular, Republican voters followed their lead. And we see these rapid declines in voters' views on whether these options should be offered to all voters, regardless of the reason that that voter wants to use that option. And what happened here is this polarization around mail and early voting created a dangerous cycle. As Republican leaders attacked mail and early voting, their voters became less likely to use those options. And because of that, ballots cast through mail and early voting would be overwhelmingly cast for Democratic candidates, which would only deepen suspicion among Republican voters. It's sort of this self-perpetuating cycle that leads to less faith in the election system, less confidence, and a more negative view of these expanded voting options. And a lot of political leaders seeing this cycle happen only fanned the flame of these suspicions further by spreading disinformation about the integrity of mail voting. And going forward, this presented an entirely new risk for election administration. So as voting methods became politically polarized, the practices themselves became vulnerable to attack for political reasons. And we've, of course, seen these efforts to curb access to the ballot in different ways, but we had never really seen this polarization of voting methods, making those methods uniquely vulnerable to attack. And this polarization is why, after an election with the highest turnout in over a century, the lesson for many legislators and for advocates and other party leaders is that voting was too easy in 2020. In 2021, legislators across the country introduced more than 440 bills with provisions that restrict voting access. And at least 34 such laws passed in 19 different states. And you can see a map here where the states in blue are those that passed new restrictive voting laws. I do want to caveat here that whenever we talk about this data, it's important to note that not all restrictive voting laws are the same. Some go much further than others, will have a much larger impact on voters than others. But this map does show where states sort of went backwards in how easy it is to register to vote and to cast a ballot. And I do want to note as well, this number that I just mentioned, so 34 laws passed in 19 states, this is the highest number of restrictive voting bills that we've seen pass since the Brennan Center began tracking voting legislation in 2011. And also this trend is not slowing down. Already in 2020, legislators in at least 27 states have introduced pre-filed or carried over nearly 250 bills that have restrictive provisions in them. When we look closely at these bills, we see a lot of common features. So some of the bills are a continuation of restrictive trends that have been going on for at least a decade and longer, but especially in the aftermath of the Supreme Court striking down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. For example, there's a number of bills that impose strict voter ID requirements or make it easier for states to remove voters from registration lists. But most of the bills that we're seeing are a direct response to the expanded voting options that were featured in 2020 and the high use of these options by voters. So you can see a lot of those on the screen here, but some of them include bills that would shorten the time to apply or return a mail ballot, bills that would prohibit election officials from automatically sending mail ballot applications to voters, bills that limit the availability of mail ballot drop boxes, and bills that limit early voting days, hours, or locations, or sometimes all three. And though it's still early, because we're in the first federal election year since 2020, we're already seeing some of the new effects that these new laws are having. So Texas has a March primary. So people right now are applying to receive mail ballots and also returning those mail ballots. And we're seeing some counties are rejecting as many as half of all mail ballot applications because of new rules that the legislature passed in 2021 about how those applications need to be filled out, what sort of ID requirements are necessary, and generally just requirements that were not well thought through and are leading to very difficult implementation, both for officials as well as voters trying to understand what is required of them now. Also in Georgia's elections last fall, where there were some local elections, the share of mail ballots returned by Dropbox dropped about half compared to 2020. And that's again after a new law that limited the availability and hours that voters could use drop boxes. And crucially, it said that drop boxes could only be available during early voting hours, which defeats one of the key points of having drop boxes in that they are convenient. You can stop by them whenever you have availability in your day, drop off your ballot, and you're on your way. You know your ballot is in a secure location. You know it's going to be picked up by election workers, and it'll be there on time to be counted. And the impact of these new laws will not be shared equally by all voters based on studies from previous restrictive bills and practices. So for example, we know that even before these new bills, studies in Georgia in particular showed that mail ballots cast by voters of color were rejected at higher rates than those of white voters in Georgia. There are also studies showing that voters of color tend to face longer wait times in polling places, are more likely to be impacted by polling place consolidation, and are also less likely to have identification that fits strict requirements. And another way that the vote suppressive legislation and activity we're seeing is different than anything that we've seen before, certainly before 2020, is that legislatures are not just restricting voters and how they cast their ballots. They're also targeting the election officials who successfully pulled off the 2020 election through a historic set of challenges, who took a lot of measures that would make it easier, safer, more secure for voters to cast ballots, and who stood up to partisan pressure to cast doubt on the integrity of election results. So some of these bills that we're seeing include bills that would allow political partisans to seize control over certain election administration responsibilities that are typically handled by professionals. There are bills that would allow partisan takeovers of local election administration, such as a state authority removing a local election official and appointing a state designated replacement. We're seeing bills that authorize these sham election reviews, like what we saw in Arizona, like what is trying to be launched in a bunch of other states now, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Texas, among others, that are really designed to do nothing but cast doubt on legitimate election outcomes and in many ways justify further restrictive provisions. We're seeing bills that would coerce election officials with criminal and civil penalties. And we're seeing bills that would empower partisan poll watchers at the expense of election workers. And this political targeting and partisan interference is taking place in a backdrop of election officials facing a torrent of harassment and violent threats following the 2020 elections. And talking to election officials across the country, we've heard horror stories of election officials who have had to move because, protesters were showing up on their front lawn and calling them and, threatening to hurt them and their families. I talked to a election official in Arizona who said that he has to have go bags packed for his teenage daughters in case at any point it's unsafe for them to return home. These things have been shockingly common since 2020. Some of the polling that we did showed that about 1 in 3 local election officials said that they have felt unsafe at some point in their job as an election official. And nearly 1 in 5 said that they've been threatened because of their job as an election official. And the most concerning thing, besides just the horrifying impact on these individuals who are doing their job, is there's a real risk that all of this, these threats, these harassment, this partisan interference is actually going to push out experienced election administrators, cause them to leave the positions that they have out of exhaustion or fear for their safety, and they're going to take a lot of knowledge and experience with them. And as these experienced professionals are leaving election administration, there are now a wave of election deniers who were emboldened and activated by disinformation following the 2020 election, and they're now looking to fill roles as state and local election officials. And this includes Secretary of State races in key swing states, which are receiving a huge amount of attention like we've never seen before, with total contributions to candidates 3 times as high as they were at the same point in 2018, which is what this graph is showing here. And importantly, these races are going to determine who will be overseeing elections at the state level in 2024. So, looking forward and kind of wrapping up here, it's obvious a lot of scary trends. And I try to avoid being, hyperbolic or sort of making these doomsday prophecies when I do these talks. But I think it's clear that our democracy is facing a real and in many ways unprecedented challenge in this moment. And it's important to raise the alarm about some of the potential worst case scenarios so that we can put in place measures now to prevent those things from happening and to prevent the impact on all voters, but especially those who, again, face disproportionate harm from these sorts of policies. But at the same time, I do want to stress that it's not, a moment of hopelessness. 2020 was also an incredibly successful election, again, in achieving historic participation while maintaining safety. And election officials, both Democrat and Republican, stood up for democracy and thwarted attempts to overturn results at every turn. And even as we see a wave of anti-democracy movement, we're also seeing a flood of support for democracy. So while states passed new restrictive laws at a rapid rate in 2021, as I mentioned, we also saw at least 25 states enact 62 laws that would expand the right to vote. And these expansive laws often made voting options that were introduced in 2020 permanent now or more useful for voters. So this could include expanded early voting, greater access to mail ballots, and the expanded use of ballot drop-off locations. So you can see here on the map where the light blue are states that passed only restrictive laws. The medium blue, I guess, passed only expansive laws, and then the dark colored passed a mix of expansive and restrictive laws. Again, with the caveat that just as not all restrictive laws are the same, not all expansive laws are the same either. And some of these will go much further than others in facilitating the right to vote. And again, as I displayed before, that there are a lot of common themes in the restrictive bills. You can see sort of common themes as well in the types of expansive bills that we're seeing across the country. So all this is just to say that, you know, democracy is a never-ending project, and it really depends on the participation of all of us to keep it alive. But I want to be mindful of my time here. Happy to answer questions at the end. And I'll stop there and turn things back over to Catherine.
Thank you, Derek. And I can speak, at least for myself, I'm definitely a visual learner. So the charts were very helpful in terms of your presentation. Now at this time, I just asked if Barb could speak to some of the less obvious examples of voter suppression methods and how exactly those methods affect voters on a local level. So New York State and or Monroe County specifically. Barb?
Okay, thanks a lot. So I'm going to share my screen so I can have PowerPoint too. Get that going. Okay, so I guess this is my main headline is you don't have to use overt suppression techniques to get low turnout. New York State has pretty good laws on the whole. I'm proud of us in many ways. And yet we were 40th in voter turnout in 2020, which is discouraging. So we have done some good things in the last few years, and I'll go over those quickly, but we shouldn't be overconfident, and there's a lot of other issues, and I'll talk more about those. All right, so let's talk about the good stuff that's happened in New York in recent years. We got early voting. We were pretty late to the party, as we just saw, but we got it, and it's been adapted by our voters. You know, it took a couple of years for it to really catch on, but by 2020, a third of the voters were using it, so that was great. We've adapted but not yet implemented automatic registration, meaning that whenever you interact with the DMV first and then another series of New York institutions, you will automatically be registered to vote unless you decline to be registered. So that will make a big difference in how many people are not registered. We can pre-register 16 and 17-year-olds, which might not be a big deal to everyone, but we at the league spend a lot of time doing voter registration drives, and we can get into high schools to do them quite often, but a lot of high school students are not yet 18. So this is really good news for us. And then, of course, during 2020, we had no excuse absentee ballots for the first time, which was great. I'll talk more about that later, about our failure to keep that on a permanent basis. We can finally do online registration via the Department of Motor Vehicles website. And again, we were pretty late to the party. New York is a blue state, but we're conservative as far as election law goes. I would say that it's a good thing, but it's not a great thing, because the DMV website itself is about comparable to an old-fashioned literacy test in terms of making it pretty difficult to make it through the process. I find it quite challenging myself. This next one has not yet been implemented. I believe it rolls out in 2023. I think it's going to turn out to be a big deal for a whole class of voters, and that is portability of voter registration. So when you move in New York State, within New York State, your voter registration is supposed to stay valid, so you can show up at your new polling place and you're still registered, even if you didn't manage to notify them of the change of address in advance. And I'll mention that again later. The introduction of electronic poll books, which came in the wake of early voting because they were necessary to early voting, is a great thing. For a lot of you, it might not seem like a big deal, right? You sign an iPad or you sign a pad. So what's the big difference? But the difference is that the electronic poll book has the entire database of all the voters for the county in it. So if you're in the wrong place, they still know that you're a registered voter and they know where you should be voting. And it's very simple for them to either print out the directions to where you should go or text them to you on your cell phone, so that it makes it easier for those who are in the wrong place. And finally, we've got New York City trying out ranked choice voting last year, which I think is an important step to making the process more rational. We know that, if you have a primary with 15 candidates like they had for the mayor, you can have, unfortunate things with splits occurring and candidates winning who aren't that popular, wouldn't be most people's first or second choice. So ranked choice voting is a good move there. So those are the good things, but we shouldn't be overconfident. So here I want to talk about the weakness of our system. Okay, in most states, you heard Derek talking about secretaries of state running elections. In New York State, we have a board of election system where the people are chosen by the two major parties, which, is kind of crazy. Those parties, why do they have that power? And it makes the choice of Board of Election commissioners vulnerable to all kinds of political paralysis and machinations. We got a taste of that in Monroe County in 2020 when was it Colleen Anderson, was that her name, resigned as the Democratic commissioner, and it took 9 months, 12 months before she was replaced, and it led to a complete schism in the Democratic Party, which is still with us in the county legislature. It was coming down to okay, so the Democratic Party is supposed to nominate someone, and then the legislature is supposed to confirm them, and so the legislature got to decide who counted as a Democrat, and none of that is carefully legislated. There's no clear rules and procedures, and it's just a pretty weak system. In all of that choice of, these bipartisan boards of elections, there is really no process that guarantees that you're choosing people who are professional or competent. We've been fairly lucky over the years in Monroe County, but we hear terrible stories from other parts of the state on some of the county election people. So we've got a state board of elections, which legally has responsibility to enforce state election law, but they don't actually have much power over the county board of elections who actually administer the elections. They didn't appoint those commissioners. They don't have the power to remove those commissioners. They don't have a lot of investigative power. So that's just a system that you can't be sure it's going to work very well. Over the years, we've seen some really depressing lags in technology and cooperation, both between the state and local boards and with other agencies. So I remember in 2020, the State Board of Elections website, you can look up and see where your polling place is. What they had put up a file, which was the wrong file from the Monroe County. So people were being told, people on the west side were told they had to go to polling places on the east side of the county and vice versa. And it took several days to straighten out. And it was just an appalling glitch that undermined confidence. There's also been, once they started allowing people to register to vote on the DMV, I would have thought that was all, click, click, automatic, the data flows over, but actually it took over a month for data to get printed at the DMV and sent over to the BOE and reloaded up. So there's a lot of lack of soundness in the whole system. I'll mention that the League of Women Voters is considering a major change in our positions, promoting some new proposals on how the BOE should be constituted in New York. Those will be hard fought, I'm sure. If you're not a member of the League, you're welcome to join, and then you can participate with us in the discussions. Finally, I want to move on to the fact that the same trends that affect everywhere else as far as these extreme partisan fear mongering that's driven the changes that Derek mentioned about having no faith that that absentee ballots are legitimate ballots and that they only go to people who are real voters and that they all get counted. All of those things happen in New York as well. We saw that was quite strong this past fall in the when Propositions 3 and 4 were defeated, which came as a surprise to a lot of us. Apparently, we don't listen to the Conservative Party very much, and they took out a lot of ads and defeated those propositions, which most of us who care about election law thought were going to be a done deal. So those are all things to worry about. And now I'm going to go on and talk about a whole host of other issues, which don't usually get talked about, have not been attended to. They're not all, primely intended to cause voter suppression, but they do suppress turnout. So I'm going to start with the legacy of mass incarceration. Okay, we have a tremendous number of people walking around Monroe County who have served sentences for felonies. And even though it has never been true in New York State that a felon loses their voting rights forever, the public, I don't know if we've all watched a lot of movies, or somehow the public believes that we all live in Alabama or Florida and that you can never get your right to vote back after you've had a felony. So a lot of the low registration rates that we're seeing in the low turnout neighborhoods that we're living, that we follow, I'm convinced have a lot to do with the fact that a lot of people think they can't ever vote again. So the League is planning to really spend some concentrated time trying to find people with felony histories and convince them that they can vote and try to get them to educate each other and reverse that. We were really relieved last year when the governor signed a law that took it so that it's an automatic restoration of voting rights once you finished, once you've gotten out of prison, because we had very complicated messaging for a couple of years when he was giving partial pardons, and I don't think we made much headway, but now I feel like we can. We hear allegations that float around about voter purges, about the Board of Election having double standards and rejecting classes of voters. I hear that in particular from some members of the Latinx community. We know that in New York City, suddenly, 60,000 voters disappeared off the rolls just before was it the primary in 2020 when Hillary was on the ballot against Bernie. So we know that those things are talked about. I can't verify the extent to which they really happen, but the fact that they're talked about persistently over the years makes me wonder how serious they are. We don't have an easy way to verify that. And now I want to talk about the requirement that you register in advance. It actually is quite restrictive for people who move a lot. And I didn't appreciate how big the problem was until I guess it was in 2020, we did a project where we took the names of newly registered voters in certain low turnout districts, and we mailed postcards to half of them, urging them to vote and giving them information on all their different choices on voting. And then we waited till after the election and we looked up the people we'd mailed the postcards to see how many had voted and how many hadn't, to see whether the postcards were effective. And in the process of doing that, I was shocked to discover that 15% of the people that had been on the rolls in July as newly registered voters were no longer on the rolls in the same district in January. So 15% of the population had turned over in that time, which is a lot of people. Those are people who had bothered to vote, who at some point thought they wanted to vote, and just the fact that they were mobile was presenting a barrier to their ability to vote. And this is one of those things that, will have a disparate impact, right? If you live in a neighborhood where most people own their home, the turnout is nothing like that. But if you live in a neighborhood where most people live in a rental situation, then the turnover is much higher. So it definitely gives a bias to who actually manages to vote. So to some degree, that may be solved with this new portability of registration that's supposed to be rolled out in 2023, because in theory, all of those people can just go to the poll wherever they've moved, and they should be allowed to vote at their new polling place. So that will help a little bit, but I don't know if it's really going to resolve it. One of my biggest complaints about New York State is the fact that we have our local elections in odd years. Okay, so we had turnout in 2020 that was in the range of 70%, and then in 2021 we elect the mayor and the county legislature and all the town councils, and we get turnout between 10 and 30% in all the different locations. So that in itself turns local elections into a very different proposition, that you're really only getting the insiders voting there. So it makes it much harder for new people to challenge and to get into local office. All right, let me keep on with my role of things that affect turnout. We have a lot of people who do not choose to join a political party at the time that they register to vote. Numbers vary, but it's as much as a third or a quarter, a quarter or a third of voters in the different towns and in the city don't select a party, which means that they can't vote in primaries. And in a lot of Monroe County, most of the choice is made in the primaries. Certainly in the city of Rochester, City Council and the Board of Education, the education commissioners, the big races in the primary. So you've disqualified a third of the voters from participating. And then the general elections, there's really not a lot of choice because there's usually few or no people running who aren't in the Democratic Party in the city. In the suburbs, it can be the opposite. So you're just disqualifying a lot of people from voting for local offices. And I think it would be feasible. There are places where that's not how it works, right? In Georgia and California, the primaries are nonpartisan. So whoever the top vote getters are go on to the general election. And that means that everybody gets to vote in the primary, and then everybody gets a real choice in the general election. And our persistence with party loyalty and party control is definitely suppressing our turnout. Okay, Derek mentioned polling locations earlier. We know that polling locations can be used to suppress turnout, right? If you cut locations in areas that are convenient to certain populations, they will not turn out in as big a numbers. I haven't heard a lot of complaints about that in Monroe County, although I know that during the COVID election, the first COVID election, they had trouble in some neighborhoods because the churches or other institutions, schools even that had been polling places weren't open and didn't want to have the public coming in. So that hopefully is a one-time thing. But it's always there that it could be used. And I believe in some other counties, it is used actively to suppress turnout of certain groups. Okay, so then we come to the failure to have multiple parties. Okay, so I mentioned this for the primaries. It's actually gotten better in the last few years since Democrats actually started being able to win some seats in the suburbs of Monroe County. A lot of people do get contested elections they get to vote in. I personally live in Penfield, so this past year there were the only contested elections I could vote in was judgeships and county legislators, and everything else was there's only one party to vote for. So that just doesn't stimulate interest in elections because nobody knows how to vote for judges. I say to the room full of lawyers. Most of us have trouble voting in those elections. So to have, the city systematically only has Democrats, and a lot of the suburbs have consistently had only Republicans running. It just doesn't really encourage people to go out and vote. And finally, I'm going to talk about districting. Right, we are in the period of redistricting. Monroe County has not yet managed to get its new districts drawn. And I'm going to say that how district lines are drawn affects voter turnout. That if you draw crazy districts, which nobody relates to, then it's very hard to be an informed voter or to even get remotely interested in your elections, and we see it all the time. I mean, I swear that no matter where I go in Monroe County, if I was to plant myself at the door of Wegmans or the door of the public library and ask everyone who goes in or out, do you know who your county legislator is? I would be surprised if 5% did. I think it might be more like 2%. So with the counties drawn as gerrymandered and crazy as they are, voters are both baffled and ignorant. And the fact that we don't actually have news media that covers local politics makes it even harder, right? How do you find out what your county legislator did there? It's not going to be in the newspaper. The website, you'd have to work awfully hard to find out how they voted. It's just really a lot of work to be an engaged voter in a lot of issues. I think the state districts can be that way too. I mean, certainly Harry Bronson's district has amazed me over the years. I run into him everywhere I go. And I would not have thought that all those places I've run into him could possibly be in one district, but they were. I think the new ones are a little bit more compact, and that will make it easier for voters to sort of follow and know which district they live in. But, you know, if your neighbor a block down is in a different district than you are, then it just cuts the information flow between voters on what's going on. So I consider that something that suppresses turnout, even though I'm not arguing that it was intended to do that, but I do believe that it has the effect of doing that. All right, I think I'm at the end, yes. So I would love to connect with anyone who finds anything I said interesting. I'm conscious that I've got a bunch of lawyers here, and I said I want to find all those people with felony history so we can get them registered to vote. So if anyone wants to participate in that with me, be sure and let me know, and I'll stop sharing my screen and be ready for questions.
Thank you, Barb. Thank you for taking the time to explain and highlight some of the fine distinctions between voter suppression and the factors that contribute to suppressed turnout. We appreciate that information. Now at this time, if the presenters are ready, it seems Barb, maybe, Derek, if you're also ready, we would start the question and answer segment for today's discussion. Is that okay with both of you? Okay. So the first question that I have is posed at both of the speakers, and it reads, if partisan election officials take over, is there any personal liability to them if they inappropriately overturn election results? Or is the risk that no one would be able to know /audit?
Yeah, I can speak to that. You know, this is, it's an area where it's difficult to have a lot of answers because this risk hasn't really been there for a lot of election history. We don't really have a lot of examples or a playbook of someone attempting to do this. So, you know, there are presumably legal challenges that are available that could be tested, but in many ways, there would be new legal challenges about really expanding the definition of what the right to vote entails and your right to have your vote counted in an accurate election, right? This is an area where federal legislation would be incredibly helpful. There are bills introduced that would make it easier to prevent something like this, and also to provide more clear causes of action for voters if election results are rejected by a state official. We know there are ongoing talks in Congress as well about sort of issues surrounding the Electoral Count Act and other issues that might touch on this, but it's a difficult and new challenge. To the second question of, you know, would we know if something happened? I think this is somewhere where the decentralization of American elections is really important to keep in mind, that elections are primarily run at the local level in around 8,000 different jurisdictions across the country. Each of those election officials doing their own vote counts, and then those counts are passed up through the states to the state level, where there is another canvassing and ultimate certification of results. So there is a lot of records, a lot of eyes on the process, a lot of double checking math, all of that would certainly make the whole process more transparent.
Did you have anything to add to that, Barb?
No, I think I'm gonna let that go.
Okay. And so the next question that we have, it's posed to both of the speakers. How do we ensure that all voting machines have paper trails to avoid machine tampering? Do we need a new law?
I think this touches on a very important security concern. The idea of every ballot that's cast needs to have a paper record attached to it, that you can check that paper record. It helps facilitate the types of things that I was talking about having more transparency in the counting process, ensuring that vote totals are accurate. This is something we've actually seen a lot of great progress on across the country, to the point where I believe there are only 5 or 6 states that still have voting machines in some counties that do not have a paper trail. That's down from a dozen or so before 2020. There's a lot of great progress in this area. There continues to be more progress. I do think this is something where, federal legislation would be helpful to require a paper record of every vote cast. It's also, frankly, an area where more funding for election administration would be very helpful. We know there are a couple states who want to replace their equipment because it's 10, 15 years old at this point, but just don't have the resources to do it. But yes, I think it's an important step towards building security and reliability of election results.
Barb, would you like to add anything to that?
I agree with that. And I mean, that's been a league position for years. I can remember my mother back in the 90s was a league member in Kansas, and all of the league ladies were voting absentee because they didn't trust those new machines that didn't have paper trails. So yeah, it's a long-standing issue. And again, federal legislation would be really helpful.
So the next question that we have, it's posed to Derek. So the question reads, what does it mean to expand voter purges or risk faulty voter purges?
Yeah, so the types of bills that we talk about in that category are laws that make it easier to incorrectly remove a voter from the voter rolls. So there are, various state and federal laws that dictate when and why you can remove a voter because they moved or because they passed away or are otherwise no longer qualified to vote in that jurisdiction. But the ways that states and local jurisdictions go about figuring out which voters they can remove at any given time, there are reliable processes, and then there are highly faulty processes. A lot of those faulty ones involve not allowing enough time to pass, relying on inactivity of voters to assume that they're no longer, qualified to vote or living in that jurisdiction. There are a lot of faulty matching programs that try to look at whether a voter has moved or is living in a different county. And a lot of times these don't use enough information to actually determine that both of those people who you think are the same voter are actually the same voter. And this is another area where there's a real disproportionate impact because there are some communities who are more likely to have common names than other ones. So for example, I always remember this. If you looked up the name Maria Garcia, who was born in 1980, you would find 12 results in Arizona and 7 in Maricopa County alone. And so the idea of, taking these small points of personal information and using that to determine which voters can be removed, those are the types of things that we're talking about.
And there's that matching thing is a really big deal. So sometimes I've heard cases where, all three, like the first name has to be spelled exactly the same, the middle initial has to be there, the last name has to be exactly the same. And there's just a lot of people that there's some variation in how their name appears, like if they're hyphenated, or God forbid, they would be a double last name that doesn't have a hyphen. So then they'll get one of them cut off. And so using that kind of matching stuff to disqualify voters is a nightmare. And also, there's like, what list do you look at? So Florida is kind of famous for taking lists of prisoners and finding matches using very liberal rules for matching, right? And if anything close to the spelling is the same, then they knock people out. So if you have a noticeably African-American name, you have a much higher probability of getting falsely matched with some prisoner who might not be you, and then you're purged from the voting system.
Thank you both. So at this time, we're going to take a second to go ahead and actually present the CLE number or code for our attorneys that are here to collect the CLE credit. We have reached the hour mark of the presentation. So those who are ready, tonight's code is 4229. Again, that's 4229. Now that you've all received the code, I would hope that you stay for the remainder of the questions because it promises to be an engaging conversation. So I would go to the next question. And the next question is again posed at Derek, and it reads, what is the easiest way to determine which candidates are not election deniers in the swing states?
Yeah, I can't really speak to particular races or candidates. I will say that in many ways, these sort of conspiracy-driven ideas about elections have become a little bit more mainstream. And so in many ways, candidates who support these ideas are not necessarily shy about voting their opinions or voicing their opinions on these things. And in fact, it's a tactic to talk to the voters who they want to talk to. And I think this is another area where, again, the decentralization of American elections is really both a strength and a weakness. The strength that I alluded to, that it takes a lot of people to run an election. And so there's only so much that one person in one office can actually do to change an outcome. But at the same time, the fact that there are so many critical positions to election administration who are holding office at the local level as a clerk or a registrar or whatever it may be. I think Barbara kind of talked about this, where it's difficult as a voter to be educated about these offices, about the people running for these offices. A lot of times there are sort of media deficits in many areas where there's no longer a local news institution who will inform about these races. And so that's where it is difficult to understand who is running for these positions and sort of what impact each candidate would have on that role.
But it's perfectly fair to ask them, right? A lot of candidates, they go on call-in debate shows, public radio. They're around here, they do that. The League of Women Voters produces vote411.org, which is a national online voter information service. So like we ask certain questions to all the candidates, and so you can find out how to contact the candidates and ask them if it's not in their voting material. And you know, a lot of them will say what they think, and you can use that to decide whether you want to vote for someone or not. I've seen people change their minds about someone who sounded kind of plausible till they heard him say, yeah, I think the election was stolen.
So the next question that we have for from the audience is posed at both speakers, and it reads, how do you dispel disinformation about widespread voter fraud?
Barbara, do you have any first thoughts on this?
Well, you know, it's a really hard job because there's well-funded people purveying the misinformation. So, I mean, I can tell you, you know how to do it, right? But whether you'll succeed or not is another question. You know, anyone who actually reads factual news, you know, every court case that challenged any voter outcomes this past year, the judges threw it out, and those included judges appointed by every president, Republican and Democrat, in the last 30 years. So, you know, the facts are clear. People don't really decide things based on facts. They decide based on feelings and emotions. So, you know, I actually spend a fair amount of time attending workshops on how to talk to people without raising their hostility and how to break through their emotions. And I commend those to you. I think it takes something like that. I'm constantly surprised when it comes up. Like, you know, we're always just trying to publicize basic facts like what the date of the election is and what the options are for how to vote. So like we put little graphics up on Nextdoor to say, early voting starts next Saturday, and here's a graphic with and you know, I get 30 personal attacks on me on Nextdoor from people who think that's all promoting hoax voting and we shouldn't use it and nobody else should be allowed to use it. And so it's not going to go away anytime soon.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's hard. I think it is one of the hardest challenges that's really facing our democracy right now, because so much of it is people seeking out information that sort of supports their political views or that supports their pre-existing ideas. And if it kind of feels good to believe it, it can be detached from reality. And so it's not always as simple as sort of, you know, just like myth busting or fact checking someone, because it was never really rooted in factual basis to begin with. So this is something I spend a lot of time doing as well, just trying to talk about the actual mechanics of the election process, what sort of checks are in place. I think this is another one where, just as you mentioned, Barbara, you can talk to candidates for these positions. You can talk to election officials, and you know, if you do so in a polite way, if you refer people to them in a polite way, they kind of love talking about their jobs. They love talking about, like, here's all the things that are in place to make sure that you know, voter fraud doesn't occur. And there are all these checks in place, and maybe you or someone you know is someone who doesn't want to buy into conspiracy theories, but genuinely doesn't understand, like, how do election offices make sure that the same voter doesn't cast two ballots or something like that. I don't think any of this stuff is obvious or well-known information by any means. Elections are super complicated, especially when you have 50 different sets of rules in 50 states. So I do kind of, you know, that's an option as well. You can go typically go to an election office and see them doing testing on voting equipment before an election. And you kind of see how they make sure that those machines are going to accurately count votes when voters are putting ballots in them. There are other sort of transparency measures in place that you could refer people to the extent that people can be swayed by that sort of information.
Thank you. Our next question, it reads, do you have any real concerns about the legitimacy of mail-in ballots? And if so, what are they?
I'll take that first. So, you know, I don't know as much as Derek does about all the other states, but I can say that the security that's used for absentee ballots and the verification systems in New York State are identical to what's used in person, right? We use your signature to verify that you're the same person. And, you know, we have a photo of the signature that you used when you registered to vote, whenever that was. And we have every photo of every signature you've used as you voted over the years. And we check those signatures. And we notice discrepancies and we catch people. So it's the same system. I'm not going to say that it's totally impossible to falsify signatures, but it requires a degree of sophistication and hard work that doesn't typically happen. And so I have a lot of confidence in the absentee ballots that I've seen processed. There's people working hard on verifying them. And then, I mean, lately, the good news is that there's been a lot more interest in curing problems with absentee ballots. There used to be high rejection rates for them, and that mostly those were on little technicalities that really wouldn't have disqualified the person if they were in person. So now if your ballot is going to be challenged, you get a call from the Board of Elections, or you get a letter from the Board of Elections, and you get a chance to change it. There's so I mean, yeah, the number of cases that have ever been brought over large numbers of false absentee ballots is pretty darn small. I mean, there were a few in Albany this year, I guess, and there were some in North Carolina a couple of years ago. So it's not that no one ever tries it, but I don't think it's changed any election results.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. I tried to put a resource into the chat. Hopefully that worked. If not, I'll find a way to get that to people who are on this call. But that's something that we worked on at the Brennan Center that goes through a lot of the security provisions that states have in place around mail voting, and addresses a lot of these concerns, talks about some of the best practices. Because again, you know, as I talked about in my presentation earlier, mail voting is well established in America. Election officials know how to run this properly. I think as Barbara said, that's not to say there are never instances of fraud. There are some. They're isolated, they're small, they have very small impact. When it is something like what happened in North Carolina that actually kind of changed the outcome of election, it was shockingly easy to catch, actually. They basically saw something was wrong immediately. The numbers were completely out of whack. Because there are all these sort of procedures, again, to check and double check and make sure everything is where it's supposed to be. And then there's also the fact that, you know, if you are bold enough to try to do this, thinking you won't get caught, to ultimately not make a difference at all in the election, you also face felony charges at the end of all of that. I think federal law is up to 5 years in prison. It's just a massive risk that not a lot of people would take for very low impact and very high likelihood that somebody would figure it out. But I do encourage people to check out that resource if it worth sharing it in the chat.
Thank you. So our next question that we have is posed at both of the speakers, and it reads, what efforts are made to educate voters who are naturalized citizens / immigrants about their rights to vote?
Well, I'll jump in here. So in the old days before COVID, when there were naturalization ceremonies, the League in Monroe County would show up at every naturalization ceremony and present them with a voter registration form and answer questions and help them register to vote. So that was our first step. We became conscious that their turnout rates were really low. So then we tried holding workshops in some of the city libraries to pull out sample ballots and show them what it looks like and talk them through the ballot. And that was really eye-opening. You know, a New York ballot is actually a very complicated thing. And especially if you come from a place that really never had democracy, like all the concepts are just really new and they're hard to explain and with language barriers. So I would say that that's an area that we do some work in, and we know that it's not enough. It's not done well. There needs to be a lot more work done there.
I don't have anything to add to that. I'm glad you are able to speak from some firsthand experience. I actually don't have a lot of experience in that area, but I agree that it's overlooked and there's not enough work done to reach out to those voters.
So the one time we held that workshop, I found myself trying to explain, okay, in this column, you vote for the congressman for the period from the election to January 21st. And in this next column, you vote between the same people for the term that starts on January 21st. And, oh yes, this column, this is the Attorney General. The question comes back, does the Attorney General work for the governor? Well, you could see why someone might guess that, right? Well, no, not really. The Attorney General might charge the governor with things that could cause him to leave office. Like, there's so much background on American politics that you can't fit into a 1-hour workshop on how to fill your ballot out. So it's a long-term job. We need a lot more organizing, like just long-term organizing, hitting various communities to even begin to make an impact on people's ability to be informed voters. And, you know, I talked about how low the turnout is. So I didn't really go into the extreme examples. I worked in an election last fall where the turnout in my little district was 3%. So like, that's really discouraging. And when you think about why people don't vote, I mean, they know that they don't know. And so how do you convince them in their busy lives, which are often chaotic and difficult, that they really need to pay attention to these obscure people who think they're important enough to run your life? And then the offices are convoluted and they can't understand the assign, you know, it's a lot. It's really a lot. And it takes more than some league ladies coming in telling you the date of the election. It takes really some long-term mobilizing, and that's really hard work.
Thank you, Barb. The next question that we have, it's posted at Derek. It's a 2-part question, so I'll give you each part separately. So the first part states, can you tell us which New York laws specifically were passed recently to limit voter participation?
Yeah, I will. What's that?
I wondered about that while you were talking. I couldn't think.
Oh, yes. This is, again, my caveat, not all restrictive bills are created equal. I will go ahead and try to share the link to where that information on all these bills actually comes from on the Brennan Center website. I believe the New York one was the bill that changed the application deadline for a mail ballot so that you have to submit your application earlier than what you used to have to, and more days before the election is actually the one that we looked at. And that came in the context of some other reforms. So it's unclear what the impact will be, but that's the way our team codes provisions like that.
It also
Thank
came
you.
in the context of the US Post Office being attacked in ways that none of us really ever thought would happen, right? That was not on my list of voter suppression techniques before 2020.
Agreed, yes.
The second part of the question, it reads, why does New York show up as a state that made voting more restrictive? I believe that may be referring to the chart that you showed earlier, Derek.
Oh, so that's what I was just alluding to. So that map showed if you passed a bill with a restrictive voting provision, it only takes one bill to do it. So essentially, once that's there, New York will show up as that color on the map there. But New York is one of the states that also has passed expansive voting laws as well. I'll try to find that link here to share.
So in your chart, stating that it's one of the mixed states, it was the darker blue color, correct?
Yes, the darker blue was the mixed states.
Okay. So we have another question. And the question is posed by both of our presenters today, and it reads, what are your views on fusion voting?
I'm sorry, on what voting?
Fusion voting, if any.
Oh. Derek, do you want to go first?
You know, I was actually wondering if you had both views on that, because I know it's an issue that's a lot more high profile in New York, because there are very different sort of ballot access laws, and not in every state can you be listed under multiple parties in the way that you can in New York. So it's not actually an issue that I personally have looked into a lot.
Yeah. Now I'm just talking as Barbara Grosh rather than the League of Women Voters, because I don't think we have a position on it. I mean, I've kind of admired that it's given some small groups more voice than they probably would if they were just a wing of the Republicans or the Democrats. So I've always kind of admired them as plucky, but you know, I don't love all of them, right? I don't love them equally on both sides of the party, but I don't think we have a comment on what the overall effect on elections is.
Well, thank you. You both handled that very well. The next question, it's posed at both of our speakers, and it reads, can you address, if it has not already been addressed, the impact of inadequate funding has on state and local elections?
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty easy, right? If there's inadequate funding, then stuff won't go the way it's supposed to go, right? You won't have enough polling places, you won't have enough election inspectors, you won't have enough equipment to make sure that you don't have long lines. I mean, all bets are off if the funding's bad enough.
Yeah, completely agree. I think it's a very large issue. It's one that's overlooked a lot. as I kind of talked about with the trend of how election administration has changed, elections are becoming more complicated. They're more complicated today than they ever have been. Part of that is because the number of different ways that voters can cast their ballot. Election seasons are getting longer. Again, all good things, very good things for voters. But it's harder. It takes more people, it takes more facilities, it takes more resources. The other big change is elections are more dependent on technology than ever, again, in good ways. Online voter registration is excellent. It's a lot easier for voters, but there are new things that can go wrong if your system is insecure or is unable to handle capacity or shuts down all the time. Same with electronic poll books are new to New York. Great in a lot of ways, a lot more efficient, can make different methods of voting like vote center based models, as most places in New York have for early voting. Those are easier to do with e-poll books, but it's another piece of technology. It costs money to purchase, to maintain. So just in general, it's more to run an election than it ever has been before. And funding has really not kept up with that. Federal funding in particular has been inconsistent at best. There were a couple of rounds of funding in 2018 and 20, which were the first serious funding from the federal government in over a decade. And even that was just a one-time injection of funds, no promises that that money will keep coming to states in the future. And in states, it varies a lot, but in New York, elections are almost solely funded at the local level with local revenue. There are some state grants that help out with that. But if you're funded at the local level, it means you're going to have huge disparities in funding between different counties that have more resources, higher tax base than others. So both the disparities in funding and the amount of money, I think is really important, and voters always bear the consequences when we sort of cheap out on the amount of money we want to put into elections.
Thank you. Our next question, it reads, what is the likely impact of hyper-local elections like school boards that are impacted by disinformation?
I would say you'll have more polarized bodies such as school boards, which seems to be happening, and you'll get more disruption and less consensus. I've been amazed at what's happened at school boards in Monroe County in the last year. I
agree with that.
Make schools run better.
I think especially in the context of, what Barbara was talking about in New York, a lot of these local elections take place in off years with incredibly low turnout. This is true in many places across the country. So when not that many people are showing up to the polls, and some of the people who are showing up are activated by disinformation, and I think maybe more passionate about that because they see certain stakes that may not actually exist in reality. It can have real consequences for the types of candidates who can be elected in those scenarios and who are put in charge of vital public services.
Thank you. The next question we have is a bit lengthy, so bear with me. But it reads, the Supreme Court having gutted the Voting Rights Act, and now that the John Lewis Voting Rights Act has been defeated, should voters of color be concerned about voting in the future, given some of the state laws enacted that you discussed earlier? And what can be done if so?
I would say yes, absolutely. Voters of color should be worried. Absolutely, they should be worried. If they're not worried, they're not paying attention. So what can be done? Well, a lot of it, because we haven't been able to pass federal legislation, falls to the level of states. So we need extensive organizing within states, and we need to have Stacey Abrams cloned and have someone as active as her organizing resistance and organizing voters. And, it's frustrating that it's state by state, because a lot of us sitting around here would love to do something effective. There are actually a few ways that we can help, right? There are groups who get lists of purged voters from all those states where they're purging voters, and spend time phone calling or texting or writing letters to those purged voters. A lot of them don't know they were purged. And I'm told it's one of the most pleasant types of voter work you can do. You call someone and they're actually willing to talk to you. They're happy that you called. They want the information that you have. It's totally different than phone banking for a candidate. And that they can succeed in getting a lot of people restored to the rolls and able to vote and knowledgeable about when the election's coming up. So that kind of work just needs to go on massively all over the country.
Yeah, I agree with that. Another one is sort of organizations that help voters cure absentee ballots. I think that's another one where we saw a pretty big difference in that there were much higher rates of voters fixing mistakes with their ballot envelope if somebody had reached out to say, look, there was this error, maybe you forgot to sign here or date here or whatever it may be, but you have the opportunity to fix that, and here's how. And a lot of people don't know that that's the case, and they don't even know that their ballot is about to be rejected. So I think that's another one where the sort of direct work with voters we've seen make a real difference. But I think overall, I just agree that there's absolutely a reason for concern. As the questioner alluded to, we're operating with a lot less guardrails because of what the Supreme Court has done to the Voting Rights Act. And so there is just, there's more opportunity here. But also it shouldn't be hopelessness as a response.
Yeah, lawsuits are really effective in a lot of cases, right? There's been important lawsuits won in various voter suppression states. I'm proud that the League of Women Voters is often a party in those lawsuits. I know the Brennan Center is also. Probably the ACLU is important. So donate to those groups and volunteer with them as well. I mean, you can also go and be on the ground as a volunteer in states where you suspect voter suppression is important. I know I met Jill Paperno, who invited me on tonight when she was doing that in 2008 in Ohio. So there's a good tradition of that. There's means to do it. I've been saying I'm going to go to Georgia and hand out sandwiches. I haven't done it yet, but I can't believe that they can make people wait in lines for hours and then make it illegal to give them a bottle of water or a sandwich. So I think there's a lot of room for passive resistance, not passive resistance, you know what I'm trying to say, peaceful resistance.
Thank you for those responses. Now, one of our last few questions, it reads, we spend so much time and money annually just to try to get people to vote. What can we do so that voting just becomes natural and easy for all without so many drives and GoTV efforts?
Yeah, those are the kinds of questions the league discusses all the time. You know, we have basically what you need is a culture of voting. I mean, I grew up knowing that my parents voted and that voting is something that grownups do, and it's part of your responsibilities. So apparently there's vast parts of our public where that is not yet the case. And I'm going to point to, in the wake of mass incarceration, where you have a whole generation of people who may never have voted because by the time they were adults, they had felony records. I bet they're not teaching their kids to vote. In some areas, the league has tried to do things like work with schools so that, a classroom is challenged. Get your mommy and daddy to take you with them to the polling place. And, when you're there, they'll give you a sticker and you'll bring it in and we'll have a pizza party if we have more than the other fourth grade classes. We haven't done that here in Monroe County, but that's the kind of thing that turns it into a culture of voting. And that's what it takes.
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously I talked a lot about sort of restrictive voting laws. The minimum we can do is have voter first policies that prioritize making it easy and convenient for everyone to vote. And then after that, which, we have a long way to go just to get to that point. After that, I think, Barbara, you did an excellent job in your presentation talking about all the different things that depress turnout, even in a state where there actually has been a lot of movement towards creating more voter-friendly practices. And like the answer is it's complicated. Why someone chooses to vote or not choose to vote, there's a lot that goes into it. I do think the fact that a lot of people live in areas where elections are not competitive, that's kind of an increasing trend that we're seeing with redistricting this cycle, actually, is just getting rid of competitive districts. Politicians love sure things. They want to know exactly how each district is going to break down. That's something where, it's hard to persuade someone that their vote matters if every year they see in the general election one party winning 85% of the votes or something like that. So it's complicated.
Although, again, that should just put it at the level of the primary, and then primaries would be, but then you've disenfranchised a third of the people if people who won't declare in a party can't vote. So that's why I think that kind of rule is really important.
Yeah. And yeah, I agree. There are just a lot of structural thinking that we can do about how we elect our representatives and how we make it more likely that more people will cast meaningful votes and can elect people who they feel like will truly represent their interests.
Thank you. Those are really good answers. The next question that we have, it's actually a clarification question for one that was posed earlier. And it reads, what is fusion voting?
So fusion voting is where a candidate can be endorsed by more than one party. This is a hard thing to explain, by the way, if you have an hour to talk to someone who's never been in a democratic system. So does it matter if I vote for Andrew Cuomo on this line or this line or this line? That's fusion voting when they're on the Democratic line and the Working Families Party's line and whatever other lines they might be able to pick up. I mean, we're gradually moving against it, right, by changing the requirements a couple of years ago. So I think there used to be 10 lines on the ballot, and this past year there were only 4 lines on the ballot. So just by increasing the number of people who had to vote on that line, we were able to knock out, somebody who wanted to was able to knock out a lot of the power. So it's narrowed down the number of parties that have any effect. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. So if you get rid of it, that means that, say, a small group such as the Working Families Party can only be effective if they can put up their own candidate who has some kind of chance of beating a Democrat, say, which, frankly is unlikely. So they can have influence within the party rather than just having to be totally outside the party. So I don't know. Of course, the Conservative Party's doing that on the other side, and then all of those other 10 parties that nobody could remember what they were.
Thank you for providing that clarification. A couple of people actually had that question. So now the next question, it's actually posed to Barb, and it reads, can attendees invite the league to speak at local groups we are involved with, like neighborhood associations or charitable groups for immigration?
Oh, well, yes, you can. Yes, you can. We love doing that. And
Thank
by the
you.
way, I want to give a shout out to neighborhood associations. They have stepped up this redistricting season and made their voices heard in ways that I can't ever remember witnessing before. And I just want to hug every single one of them for showing up over and over again to tell the county legislature not to do what they did. And it's not over yet, so don't rest yet.
Our next question, it reads, what are the likely impacts on our democracy if the current trends are not checked?
I think it's hard to say. It feels like one of those things where you don't know when things have gone too far until they happen. And again, we're facing a lot of things we haven't seen before in this moment. And it's hard to know what things are temporary, what things are permanent, what things are likely to increase. And I think that's why it's important to, again, not become hopeless or anything like that. Sort of stay vigilant, be aware of some of the worst things that could happen, and take steps now to prevent those things from happening. But, I don't know if I want to speculate like too much about what could happen in 4, 10, however many years.
I mean, bad things can happen, right? These are real threats to democracy. I mean, in my lifetime, I have felt unhappy with this or that, but I always thought that the basic democratic process worked in the sense that most people could vote and your vote would count. And if enough people voted, someone could win an election. Now, I understand that for African Americans, that hasn't been true in a lot of places in a lot of times in our lifetimes, but I'm not sure that that's not at risk now. I think that is very much at risk now, and I've never felt that way before. So I find it scary, but I don't feel hopeless. I feel like we have a lot of work to do.
Thank you. Now, another question that we have, it reads for both of our presenters. It reads, do you think efforts at deep canvassing are sustainable and likely to be successful? And the audience member who asked this question provided a definition for deep canvassing as taking time for in-depth conversations with prospective voters about issues of interest.
I'm sorry, the question was, do I think those efforts are likely to be successful? Is that what the question was?
Yes, sustainable and successful.
I think this kind of gets back to what we talked about with like, how do you reach people affected by disinformation? In that it's very hard. I can tell you, you're not going to reach people and persuade people without trying. And there are certainly people who you can convince. You can get them to see things in a new light, to trust democracy in a way they haven't before. Not everyone is completely unpersuadable. So it's something I do every day, try to talk to people, try to convince people, try to build more support. Yeah, I think it's worth doing.
I mean, it's a whole different model really on how to work. Like, I just think of the rise of house parties as a campaign technique, which, I mean, I don't, maybe they were doing it somewhere else, but I associate it with like post 2008. I think I first heard of it during the Obama campaign, and it's persisted. So if you think about deep canvassing, so that you're trying to find a voter who hasn't been engaged before, and you take an hour or two to find out really what are their issues and what do they care about and what are their fears and what are their hopes, then get them to have a house party and bring in all their disaffected friends and relatives. That begins to be something that can affect a number of voters. And I don't know if it's sustainable. It's a lot of work and you have to keep it up over years. And the people that you're trying to reach have really difficult, complicated lives that they're not easy to organize. I do work with the homeless population, and I just know that like there's a lot of people that voting is really the last of the things they're worried about. And there's, if you're worried about eviction, or you're worried about whether you can pay the rent, then voting just falls right down the list.
Thank you. One of our last questions that we have, it reads for both of the presenters: how much impact do you think it would have to increase efforts to educate elementary and high school kids on civic duties like voting? And I believe you touched on this a bit earlier, but if you could elaborate in relation to high school students, because I believe your responses dealt with younger students.
We think it's really important, especially in communities where their parents might not be active voters, and we spend a lot of energy trying to get into classrooms and engage with students and convince them that it's worth voting, right? You won't necessarily get everything you want, but there are differences in the candidates and they affect your lives, and it's the minimum that you should do as a citizen. It's been much harder since COVID. It's always hard work. It's probably make 10 phone calls for every classroom we get into, just because communications are hard and reaching teachers is hard, and teachers have complicated schedules, and everything's hard. But we do it. We haven't done it a lot at lower grade levels. But I must say we had a webinar earlier this week with Shane Wiggand and Keisha James from the I'm forgetting the name of it, the anti-racist curriculum project, and they are doing wonderful work teaching actual history, including voting rights history in New York State. And I haven't looked far enough to see if they put in a pitch for voting, but it seems like it would naturally grow out of what they're doing. So that gave me a lot of hope.
Do you have anything that you wanted to add to that, Derek?
No, this is a little outside of my area of expertise, but I do think building that culture of voting, as well as other related things like sort of digital and information literacy, critical thinking, that type of thing is incredibly important. And I would be very supportive of trying to reach people as early as possible.
So the last question that we have here from the audience, it reads, and it's posed at Derek, but Barbara, if you have some feedback, we please invite you to respond as well. It reads, 2020 had a large turnout. Has the turnout dropped below prior off years since these laws went into effect?
Yeah, it's really just too early to tell with how recently these laws went into effect and how few elections we've had during that time. We might know more, this year with it being now another federal election year. Again, turnout's complicated. Then there is a lot that goes into it, and it's not always necessarily the best way to measure the impact of a restrictive voting law, especially because sometimes there may just be offsetting effects where some people choosing to vote offset the difficulty that others now face in trying to vote.
Did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
No, I don't.
Okay. So at this time, I would just ask that if the presenters had any closing remarks to share with the audience, that we do that at this time. Whoever would like to go first, please feel free. Don't jump at once. But
I'm happy to go first. So I always try to end on a positive note. And I think we've talked a little bit about some things that that you can do if you're concerned about things happening right now. So I do want to highlight a couple things. Since I know I'm speaking to a lot of lawyers, I encourage lawyers to volunteer in election protection efforts with organizations like the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights or other organizations who do this type of work. There are also organizations who are looking for pro bono attorneys to actually defend election officials who are being targeted through like political prosecution, essentially, for trying to achieve voter-friendly practices. So a couple organizations are the Election Official Legal Defense Network. It was actually just recently set up for this purpose. And there's also an organization called We the Action that does some of this work. And then for everyone, I've talked so many times about the decentralization of election administration and how many people it actually takes to pull off an election every year. So I just encourage people, I really think the best way to protect democracy is by participating in that administration of elections. Be the people who are doing things right, who are doing things with integrity, who are helping voters. So a couple ways to do that: volunteer as a poll worker. Poll workers are always needed. Great way to get into polling places and interact with voters directly. You can apply to run for an election official position, or apply for those positions or run for them, depending on your jurisdiction. Again, I know a lot of you live in New York. You may be concerned about things going on in other states. So you should also reach out to people. You have a cousin in Wisconsin or someone you went to college with in Arizona who cares about democracy. Encourage them to run for office. Be the people who are running elections in the future. And also, voice support for state and local officials who are doing the work of standing up for democracy and really trying to protect the right to vote right now. And then I think the final thing is just voting. Vote in every single election, federal, state, local. Check with local organizations like the League of Women Voters. Maybe you don't even know about an upcoming election or who's running in that or what that position does. Always try to inform yourself on those things and vote every chance you get, because beyond the number of people who are directly running elections, there are even more public officials who have impact on democracy in one way or another. So that's all I have.
So, I love the questions we've gotten tonight about making a culture of voting. And that's really what the League is doing day in and day out. We're doing everything we can think of to help people be informed about elections and to get registered for elections and to know what they need to know to be informed voters. And we always welcome new energy and new ideas. And I love the idea of being invited all over town to meet more people, because that's the kind of connections that makes a culture of voting. So there's a lot to do. There really is a lot to do. So be involved. One of our favorite slogans is democracy is not a spectator sport. So you have to get off the sidelines and join the action.
Well, thank you, Derek and Barb. And I guess with that, it concludes today's discussion. My name is Catherine McCarley, and I just want to again thank the presenters, as well as all of you for joining us today and engaging in this important conversation. I do truly hope that you learned something today, and that you go ahead and take that thing that you learned, or those things that you learned, and apply them to be able to make a better tomorrow. And with that, I just hope everyone has a great night. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.